Okay, so welcome everyone. So we started last week with an article about, I think, fear of God and fear of heaven. And this phrase appears a lot. It's the Hebrew word or verb is yirah. And my own impression, and I have to admit that these articles didn't necessarily confirm that impression, but my own impression is that yirah is two-thirds awe and one-third fear. But it certainly is not just simply fear. There's another Hebrew word pachad, which means fear in the common sense that we know it. But yirah is a combination of awe and fear. And um, so that was an interesting article, and we got through it. Tonight, it's actually a longer article, which I found very interesting. I hope you find it interesting as well. And I'm going to share it. Let's see, there it is. So let me find you guys again.
Yeah, Rabbi,
Yes.
Rabbi, may I ask you if you can make it a little bit larger because it's
You
very.
can ask it, but I don't think I can make it larger.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
if I bump it up there, I can't fit it.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not very large. I'm sure I sent the article out, so you can look at it later. So the title of the article, as you see, is "Should We Love God More Than Man?"
Man.
And it's the author is Chaim Steinmetz. And I did a little bit of research. It was a week ago when I first came across this article. He is an Orthodox rabbi, so that for me that's interesting. Let's see. Okay, um, and as we'll see, he's going
Go.
to really focus on on the story of the Akedah and um, and Abraham. So just to refresh your memory, and I have it, on Safari if we want to go back and look at the story from time to time. But basically, the text starts off by saying God put Abraham to the test. Let's say if I jump to Safaria, do you now see Safaria or are you seeing? Whoops, you see Safaria? Yeah.
Safari.
So it says God put Abraham to the test and called him, and then he says, "Take your son, your favorite son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering." So that's pretty shocking. And what's even more shocking is Abraham complies without arguing at all. Alan, you're muted, Alan.
Okay, since we're doing the Akedah, just to mention that this is the portion of this week.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've been running around. So yeah,
No,
so it's very appropriate.
yeah.
Um, and so, then we have the story, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but Isaac says to his father, here's the firestone and the wood, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering? Isaac conspicuously does not mention the knife that Abraham also has. And Abraham says, God will see to the sheep, and they get to the place, and he bound his son Isaac. So he tied up his son Isaac, and the Hebrew is v'ya'akod. It's where we get this phrase Akedah, which it's called Akedat Yitzchak, which literally means the binding of Isaac, and laid him on the top of the altar on the wood. And of course, the reason there's lots of midrash on this, and we're going to read a lot about midrash. The reason is we don't want Isaac to flinch, and we don't want Isaac to run away. If Isaac flinches and just has a wound, that wound would disqualify him from being a sacrifice. According to biblical rules about what kind of animals are eligible for sacrifice, you're not allowed to have an animal that's wounded or sick or whatever. It has to be pretty much an intact animal. So Abraham picks up the knife, and then a messenger, a malach, Adonai. The word messenger and angel can be the same word. So in other translations that you might have, a messenger calls to Abraham, and Abraham answers, and the angel, the messenger says, "Don't do anything to him, since you've not withheld your son, your favorite one, from me." And Abraham looks up and comes a kind of ram caught in the thicket by its horn. So one of the reasons we actually sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and we actually read this story on Rosh Hashanah, is to remind God of this story. And then God pronounces all kinds of blessings to Abraham, because it basically says, because by myself I swear, which is a phrase I always like, bi nishpati, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessings on you, make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashores, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command. And then they return. And then in actually some sermon work that I did, I pointed out that Abraham and Isaac never speak again to each other, and Abraham and God never speak again in the biblical account to each other. So there's all kinds of interesting things we can dwell upon here. But the major question is, let's see, before I jump to the article, I'll ask you if you want to contribute. And as you'll see, there's lots of opinions and there's no right answer. What do you think of Abraham's response? First of all, what do you think of God testing Abraham this way? What do you think of Abraham's response to God? And, I often say, did Abraham pass the test or fail the test? And did God pass the test or fail the test? So there's all kinds of interesting questions we can raise. And we have more people coming in. Yeah, Erwin, go ahead.
I would like to ask you, Rabbi, that why did God ask Abraham to kill his own creation, sacrifice his own creation?
Yeah, well, you're not going to get a simple answer from me. The text has it very clear. God put Abraham to the test. So
But
God wanted.
Why did?
Okay, so the pshat, the simple explanation, which I have all kinds of problems with, is God wanted to test Abraham's faith to see if Abraham.
But the Rabbi, in the in Genesis, I don't know exactly where, but God tested Abraham 10 times already.
Actually, the rabbis see this not before this, but maybe before this. I don't know. There's lots of tests. Yes, the rabbis study the text very carefully and come up with 10 tests. So I don't know why. I mean, talk to God. So I'm sensing you have a problem with this, and so do I.
Okay, I will.
Okay, but I don't have a simple answer. Baruch.
Yes, I'm just thinking to myself at this point, the idea that God is like a father and an all-encompassing father that built the universe, that built everything.
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't Abraham want to follow what God told him? Why would Abraham say, "Well, I'm not doing it," and God looking at him and says, Hey, I'm the master. You got to follow what I'm telling you. Don't give me any guff. That's what it's about. That's what I thought.
Okay, so you're saying this reflects a God who demands unquestioning obedience.
At this point, yes.
And I'll interject another problem with the text is if God is all-knowing, didn't God know what Abraham would do? And if God knows what Abraham would do, why would God put Abraham through this test?
That's a very good question. I don't know.
Just to Jim.
Well, the answer to the last question, I think, is God knew what he was going to do, but Abraham had to learn what he would do. Abraham needed to go through this to strengthen his faith and to test his faith so that he knew that he was faithful. And Another reason why did this all happen? Well, I'm sure you're aware of the similarities to the crucifixion and the
Jim,
Christian
Yes.
faith.
Mhm.
Um,
Jim,
Hold
no,
on a second. Hold on, Erwin, let Jim finish.
But I think one of the reasons, and I have a question for you at the end, Rabbi, I think one of the reasons that God did this is to teach us that human sacrifice is not allowed.
Right,
Because
and
prior to this, it was allowed.
that is a pretty standard, as we'll see, interpretation of the text. It's a very graphic way of teaching that. But okay. So having said that, do you think Abraham passed the test or failed the test? Because clearly Abraham was willing to sacrifice
Abraham
his
passed
son.
the test, I think.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, but
And you're absolutely right about the connection in Christian thought to the crucifixion. In fact, at the site of the crucifixion in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is a big painting of this scene of Abraham about to sacrifice his son right at that exact same spot. Because in Christian thought, God is sacrificing his son, and of course goes through with it, which is even, well, I would say even worse. But that's I'm not a Christian.
My question to you, though, you said Abraham and Isaac never spoke together. Abraham and Sarah never spoke together. Oh, I'm sorry.
Abraham and God never speak again.
That's right.
Sarah didn't either because she dies right after.
She dies, yeah, in the very next chapter.
But I had read that after this, Sarah and Abraham never lived together again.
Well, we don't know, because if you go to the end of the story, now just working with the biblical text, it says Abraham returns, and then there's some more text about other people being born. And then the next one is Sarah's lifetime came to 127 years and she died.
She died in that place. So Abraham had to go there to mourn her. So he wasn't living with her then.
I've never heard that.
Or still at the place where he did, or he wasn't yet home from doing the thing with Isaac.
Yeah, so I don't know, and I don't think the text is very clear, but he may have been traveling and doing other things. I just don't know the answer. Okay. So let me call on Alan and Stephen.
I think part of what I wanted to say, just add a little, is what Jim said, which is that there is about creating a new kind of society that did not allow child sacrifice. And so the story, that part of the story, and Rabbi have already said there's many dimensions to the story, is to explain that the new Judaism, or the Israel people, will not have child sacrifice. And that helps me be comfortable that Abraham is a member of a society where they do that. And if God asks you to do that, you don't argue with him, because you would be blasphemous if you told God that this isn't a good idea. Abraham didn't invent this idea. God taught us through this story, the way I'm taking that piece. And
right.
That's all.
But the story certainly could have ended, and therefore to this day we absolutely forbid child sacrifice. And there could have been a clear commandment at the end of the story, but we don't have any of those. And we actually have a very bizarre episode in the book of Judges called Jephthah's daughter, if you are familiar with that story. Just in a very brief nutshell, Jephthah's a general, and he's fighting a battle, if I'm remembering it correctly. And he says, God, if you let me win this battle, when I return home, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out to greet me when I return home. And it's his daughter. And he does sacrifice her eventually. I mean, he gives her time to mourn her maidenhood. There's a lot of troubling stuff in the Bible, in case you haven't figured this out yet. Stephen.
Yeah. So I think that the answer to what's the point of doing a test if you know the outcome might be, it's not so much to learn the outcome as to teach a demonstration for other people, that it's so that we will see that Abraham was willing to do this, and therefore we will be willing to do the things that are demanded of us that seem comparatively less extreme, although.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly a demonstration of Abraham's faith, without a doubt.
Like
and
that.
by having this story, we remember it more than just, one of the, say, a 614th commandment that says don't sacrifice children. So yeah, I absolutely agree. Erwin, did you have something else you wanted to add? Your hand is up.
Yes, I would like to say that I don't know this is a midrash or it's in a Talmud, but it comes up when a father and mother learns that his child does not uh, listens to him, and they want to stone the child. God says, "You cannot do that because it's mine."
No. So what there is in Deuteronomy, the text
Okay.
tells us that if you have a stubborn and recalcitrant child, the parents take him to the gate of the city, and tells the elders in the gate of the city that my son is a stubborn and recalcitrant child, and the child is stoned to death. So it's basically a capital punishment.
But they never stoned it. They never stoned
Yeah.
the child.
So then the Talmud goes on and says that in practice it never happened. That's in the Talmud, but it doesn't refer to the idea that God says this is mine, because in the Talmud the rabbis are very reluctant to have capital punishment of any kind, but there is clearly capital punishment in the Bible. Okay, so we are allowed, in fact, we are commanded to put people to death in the Bible. There's capital punishment for adultery. There's capital punishment for murder. In fact, capital punishment for murder is the only commandment that's repeated in every book of the Torah.
Really?
But
but it's not a sacrifice. It's a punishment.
But this story is that God asked Abraham to commit a premeditated murder.
Yes. So the question is, if God tells you to kill someone, is it murder? That's another
premeditated murder.
Well, it's premeditated by God. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So we got all these questions bubbling. So I assume the questions have been answered. A few of you still have your hand up, but I'm gonna jump.
I know I'm gonna take it off.
Okay. And Cindy, you have your hand up now.
Yeah, I have another question.
Okay, good.
So I don't know where along the way I heard that Abraham's son was not a child.
So the question is, how old was Isaac? Right?
30 years old.
The question is, how old is Isaac? The text doesn't tell us, but the text gives us some clues. One clue is he's old enough to converse with his father and ask reasonably intelligent questions like, here's the wood, here's the firestone, where's the sacrifice? Okay? If you believe the Midrash, that when Abraham comes home and with Isaac and they tell Sarah what happened, Sarah drops dead immediately. Then we know how old Sarah is when she died, and we know how old Sarah was when Isaac was born. So if you accept that premise, then Isaac was 17 years old. Okay? Because it never says he was a child, I think. Right. Just says he's your son.
Right. So then a whole new set of questions comes into the story, how a 17-year-old would go along with each of those actions without pushing back.
Yes. So basically, Isaac is either loyal and faithful or a wimp. Another interesting element to this story is the way it appears in the Quran. In the Quran, the son is not named. It could be either Isaac or Ishmael. And God commands Abraham to sacrifice him. There's a lot of reasons to suspect in the Quran that it is Ishmael, not Isaac. But in the Quran, there's a discussion between Abraham and Ishmael about God wanting him to sacrifice Ishmael. And Ishmael says, no problem, Dad. If God is commanding this, we obey God. Remember, the word Islam and Muslim means one who submits to the will of God. So in that text, because Ishmael, or you could read in this text, Isaac, is very obedient, then he too is willing to submit. So yeah, I get problem with that. We'll continue, Stephen, and then Jim.
Wow.
Okay, when the angels come and say Isaac's going to be born in a year, Sarah's 90 at that point, or she's 90 when Isaac's born. Then she's 127 when she dies. So how would Isaac be only? So when Isaac have to be?
Maybe he's 37. I for some reason the number 17 is fixed in my head, so I don't know, but it's a good point. Maybe he's 37. And anyway, it doesn't matter. I mean, he's not 4 and he's not 6, and he's not a child that can't push back against his father's wishes. He is old enough to, as Cindy said, refuse to go along with this.
Why does he need to be tied?
He needs to be tied so he won't flinch.
Oh, okay. So it's not because he's going to it's not because he's not submitting. It's just to prevent the reflex.
Yeah, the text doesn't tell us that he has a problem with this. In the Quran version, the text specifically says he does not have a problem with it. Jim.
Yeah, the one thing that impresses me about this that's different from us is we have this God, we have this Bible, we've known this God our whole lives, and there's all this data on him and opinions and everything. Abraham had just met him. There was no text. There was no 10 Commandments. There was nothing except this is God, but maybe not the only God. This could have been just one God.
Well, presumably Abraham has been dealing with this God for, 30, 40, 50 years.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, because if Isaac is 37, and I think Ishmael was born like 10 or 12 years before Isaac. So the call to Abraham I think Abraham is 80 when he gets the call. So he's known God for a long time.
75. Lech Lecha, he's 75.
I'm sorry?
In the beginning of Lech Lecha, when he gets
75. Okay. 75. Erwin.
Maybe his mistake was not.
Hold on,
okay,
Erwin.
Rabbi, this is the second time Abraham wants to kill his son. He sent Ishmael out to the desert with his mother to die without water and food. So, he is not a good shoe.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes comment that Genesis is a wonderful guide to parenting. Whatever you see there, don't do.
Yeah.
And the first story in traditional synagogues, the first story where Abraham basically accedes to Sarah's request that he get rid of Ishmael and Hagar. So in that story, he sends them out to die. And second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read this story. So, and that's a whole other question. Why are we reading these stories on Rosh Hashanah? The simple answer is we are reminding God of how loyal and faithful Abraham was. So we are relying on what is called Zechut Avot, the merit of the fathers. So that by reminding God about Abraham's merit, we hope a little bit will spill down onto us.
And then the other time, Abraham is lying about Sarah.
Well, we're not going to get into that. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but so he has issues.
Yes.
That's also in this portion this week. Also.
Yes, exactly.
So it's one of the reasons that I love the Torah is that it doesn't present our heroes, our patriarchs, as blameless people. They have more than a few issues, as Erwin's pointing out. My favorite example of that is King David, who is a murderer, an adulterer, and but also a poet and a singer, and also a warrior. So a very interesting character. Okay, let's jump into this text. It's actually a long text. I'm sure we'll finish it this week. So, would someone like to read? Should we love God more than man? Joanne, would you like to read?
Yeah, all right. Does Abraham love God more than his fellow human beings? He immediately jumps to follow God's command to offer his son as a sacrifice. He does not question and does not bargain. God comes first. Abraham faithfully accepts God's call despite the great cost to himself and his family. The passage in the Bible called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, has a deep and abiding influence on Jewish thought. Abraham's response at the Akedah is the polar opposite of how he responds to the punishment of Sodom. God tells Abraham he plans to destroy Sodom due to their great sins. Abraham rejects instantly and instinctively. He debates and negotiates, at one point rebuking God by saying, "Will the judge of the entire earth not do justice?" In this passage, Abraham clearly puts man before God.
So just to remind you of that story,
Right.
Abraham actually has just circumcised himself. I think he is 90 at this stage, so this is before he has children. And visitors come along, and as part of this story,
Isaac after Ishmael.
I'm sorry?
Ishmael is already born. Isaac.
Oh yeah, Ishmael's, yes, you're absolutely right. Yes, Ishmael's born. Yes. So, but it's before the Akedah is the main point. So, God or messengers tell God. Actually, we actually have God sort of thinking to God's self, "Shall I not tell Abraham this, since he's now my new partner in the covenant?" And so Abraham is informed that God intends to destroy all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham challenges God basically by saying, will the judge of the entire earth not do justice? And Abraham says, suppose we find 50 just people in these cities. Will you spare the total city for the sake of 50? By the way, it's really important to notice, he doesn't say, will you spare those 50? He asks, will you spare everyone for the sake of the 50? And God says, yes. And then we have a negotiation, 40, 30, 20, and 10. And he doesn't go below 10. And God actually says, yes, for the sake of 10, I'll spare the whole city. And of course, as we'll find out in the Torah, in Genesis, we don't even find 10 righteous people in the town, so Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. But the point is, when Abraham hears about Sodom and Gomorrah, he hastens to plead for the lives of these people. When he's told to sacrifice his own son, he literally doesn't say a word. Alan.
So we get to appreciate Abraham's, proactively speaking, negotiating. But part of me tells me God already knew there's not even 10. So whether he stopped at 20 or 10 or 5,
that's interesting.
Would be the same. But now I don't mean to take away from Adam's.
Yeah, I'm actually not talking about God now. I'm talking about Abraham.
I know.
Yeah. So, and that really is the key here. The key is, does Abraham love God more than his fellow humans, or love humans more than God?
Does that apply to us too? Is the message we're supposed to get out of that first line is, do we love God more than we love people?
I can't remember if this article actually discusses that, but I think it's a question we ask ourselves.
The reason, if I can just finish that, is that I think in my limited, and Jim would be able to make this much better, but in my limited understanding of Christianity, is they're adapting, they're going to some different place that the Jewish teaching, theology, and therefore there's this attitude about how you think about Jesus or God that's different than the way Israelites were at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is different. It's a different religion, but I don't know if you're thinking about different in a particular way.
Well, loving God versus, we use Abraham. I use him just as an example. We're supposed to be like Abraham, so I'm using that. Am I supposed to be like?
Actually, I would say we're not supposed to be like Abraham. We're supposed to be like God. I've never heard of imitatio.
Love is the word, not like, actually, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I would say certainly Christianity emphasizes love more than Judaism does in relationship with God. But here I'm really focusing, and I think this author is focusing on Abraham's response. When it comes to the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah, he is moved to argue and to actually challenge God. He doesn't say, okay, God is going to do this. Who am I to challenge God? But when it comes to his son, he doesn't challenge God at all. So that's what this article is about.
So
The disparity between Abraham's response at Sodom and at the Akedah is puzzling. There are technical ways of resolving this question, noting distinctions such as between when God approaches for a dialogue or with a command, or between making a personal sacrifice and pleading for the lives of others. But I find those resolutions unsatisfying. At its core, this contradiction forces us to choose one passage as a paradigmatic, as the ultimate lesson of Abraham's faith, and which one is chosen will depend a great deal on how one understands the lesson of the Akedah.
So I just want to make one comment, because I was puzzled by this when I first read it. The distinction whether God approaches as a dialogue or a command. So in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, God doesn't command Abraham to do anything. He basically says, I'm going to share with Abraham what I plan to do in Sodom and Gomorrah. So, in this consultation, Abraham speaks up. In the case of his son, in the Akedah, God commands Abraham. And so that's, that's one way which this author calls technical ways of resolving the question, which he finds unsatisfying. Baruch.
Yes, I'm thinking now as a person who did therapy with other people. And if I was sitting across from somebody who came into my office because they were going to be arrested because the mother of the family and the little boy wanted to be safe from the father. The father was going to hurt them. And I don't know what I'd say at that point. I don't know. I'm not a God, so I don't know what I'd say. But the idea is, why didn't Abraham get some feedback from somebody else before he started this whole thing? Before he started,
who else?
He started to hurt his son. Why didn't he go get some feedback
from whom?
I don't know. Maybe I don't know. That's the idea.
So on one level, there are no other monotheists at this point. I mean, presumably he could ask his wife, but you can imagine what she would say.
Yeah, I know.
So yeah, but it's
it says more about us than it does about Abraham and Isaac.
I think it says about Abraham. But one of the ways I looked at this story is, does Abraham sacrifice his children over his job?
Gee, Mani. Oh my gosh.
So
that's a powerful statement. That's powerful.
So I'm sorry?
How could somebody hurt his son because of his job?
Have you ever heard of people? I'll be paradigmatic here and talk about men who work at their job 18 hours a day, don't show up for their kids' basketball, don't show up for their kids' birthday parties, may have a lover on the side.
Yes.
When asked, why are you acting like such a jerk?
Right.
The response will be, well, I'm doing this all for you.
There you go. That's exactly right.
So I it's one of the ways I look at this story.
Yes.
It's clear to Isaac that Abraham was willing to sacrifice him for the sake of his job, being, the first monotheist.
Right.
Erwin.
How interesting.
I would like to ask you, you mentioned Sodom, that he was bargaining with God.
Right.
And then I remember, why did God ask Jonah to sit in the front of the town to save Nineveh?
Because Jonah was a prophet and God wanted the people of Nineveh to repent.
Yeah, but why did God want to destroy that?
Because they were sinners. They were sinning and they were doing terrible things. And the unusual.
So I imagine that's what happened in 1949, 1942, when God destroyed 6 million Jews.
Okay, I'm not going to go there. I'm just saying, traditional understanding, one understanding of why God allowed the Nazis to murder is because the sins
nobody was sitting in the front of the cities.
Are you saying the reason that 1.5 million children were murdered was because they were sinners?
No, I am saying nobody had and all those people were murdered because we didn't have a spokesman to
So you
speak
think
for
you think
God.
if a prophet went to Hitler and said, "Don't do this," Hitler would have said, "Oh, okay. Why didn't I
No,
think of
no,
it?"
no, no. The prophet should have talked to God.
Right. So okay. I'm not going to go to Nazi Germany, and this discussion will get way too off track. So
In,
let's
in
continue,
none
Joanne.
of the cases does the prophet get God to reconsider. In Nineveh, the prophet gets the people of the city to repent, and that causes God to reconsider. In Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham tries unsuccessfully to talk God out of it, and God still goes ahead with it. So
Right.
God, the prophet talking directly to God does not work.
Yes, and I would say the only example of a prophet actually delivering the message and the people complying is in the case of Jonah. And Jonah is so upset with this, he wants to commit suicide. But that's a different study. It's the study of Jonah. Alan, you're muted.
And it's ironic because given how he must have looked after having been inside the whale or fish for a while, you'd think that he would be immediately assumed by everyone to be.
Okay, but it was gefilte fish, so it wasn't that big a problem. Alan.
So I believe in the principle of creation, which means it's an evolutionary process that we get to appreciate, and the roles of the patriarchs like Abraham and Isaac are a different level of maturity on how to relate to God than we think of prophets. So we've tried to create some parallel here, and I've decided they play different roles because of the way I believe that when God said, when Genesis says God started the process of creation, these things are the evolutionary thing that we're focusing on Abraham now, and I think the Jonah thing is a later concept.
Yes, and and Islam considers all of these guys prophets, and I will point out that every religion closes its prophecy. So we don't accept the idea that there are prophets authentically speaking for God today. But Joanna's going to authentically speak for this article. So successive generations.
Successive generations of commentaries have offered their own interpretations of the Akedah. Already in the Book of the Maccabees, the Akedah is seen as the inspiration to martyrdom and rebellion. At this perspective of the Akedah becomes very influential. Rabbi Meir in the Sifrai explains that the commandment to love God with one's entire soul, which is found in the first paragraph of the Shema, means that a Jew is obligated to love God as much as Isaac, who tied himself down on the altar as a sacrifice to God.
Wow.
Okay, so the text is exploring what various rabbis, how they interpreted the text. So it says, you shall love God b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, which is understood as being your mind, b'chol nafshecha, with all your life, with all your living, v'chol meodecha, and with all your everything. So what does it mean to love God with all of those things? What this rabbi is saying is you should be willing to martyr yourself for God. And that's also one of the things that we see in the Maccabees. There's the story, I think it's even recounted in this article, in fact, it's the next paragraph. So let's go on.
Indeed, martyrdom becomes so much part of a Jewish life that several texts note how the martyrdom of later generations exceeds the Akedah. The Talmud tells the story of Hannah, a woman whose 7 sons were martyred by the Romans. Before her 7th son is executed for his faith, Hannah tells him, "Go and say to your father Abraham, you bound up 1 son to the altar, but my mother has bound 7 sons to altars." In a 13th century poem, Rabbi Ephraim of Bonn writes, recall to our the many Akedahs?
Yeah, it's going to be the first line of a poem. So I'll read the poem. Recall to our credit the many Akedahs, the saints, men and women slain for thy sake. That's just part of this poem. The point is, some of these rabbis are looking at the Akedah as the model of offering yourself to God as a martyr. And in Jewish tradition, there are a number of things where you are actually required under Jewish law to offer yourself to be killed rather than do. And the most significant one, I would say, in the context of this discussion, is public blasphemy. So if someone, has a gun to your head and asks you to kiss the cross or to acknowledge Hitler as the great ruler, or to, or a different religion, you are to sacrifice yourself rather than commit public blasphemy. Okay. You want to continue?
Rabbi, there's like three things that.
Yes, there's three things: public blasphemy, certain murder, and sexual sins, incest, adultery, and so on.
I thought idolatry was on the list.
You'll have to ask God. Jim.
Public blasphemy. So if somebody...
I said public blasphemy.
Yeah. So if somebody puts a gun to your head and demands that you blaspheme God, but nobody else is around, now what do you do?
I think you're allowed to do that to save your life. Yeah, a real example. I'll give you two real life examples. One is from a guy I met, a Holocaust survivor, and he was traveling and trying to get away from the Nazis, and was on a train because that's the way you got around Europe. And he would keep a big slab of bacon with him on the train, or ham. And when Nazi soldiers would walk through the train, he would be there eating the ham to cover the fact that he was not Jewish. Another one, which is a whole other issue, I have a book called Responsa: Jewish Legal Decisions of the Holocaust. And there's a case there where a person says basically he can buy a forged baptismal certificate to prove to the authorities around him that he's not Jewish, but he's really Catholic. And the rabbi rules that no, you have to surrender your life rather than basically announce to the world that you're Catholic. I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm saying these are Jewish legal decisions. And to be more realistic about Stephen's question about adultery and incest and so on, I would say many religions are obsessed with sexual relations. I mean, on Saturday mornings we're in the midst of discussing Leviticus 20, and the details of all of that, and what sexual relations cause you to be put to death. Baruch.
Yes, my feeling is that it's just really very. It's not really. Let me just say it this way: it's the start of a population of people. It's the start of our generation. It's the start of our ability to be a population, to be effective as a population. So my feeling is what this is teaching us is how to live in society. I think that's part of it, is how to live respectfully, even though God is telling us one thing, we need to do another thing. If that happens, then God says, wait a minute, I told you to do this, now you're doing this. What's going on? I think it's important to know that at this point in culture, we're starting to understand how God and man work together. And my feeling is that we're starting a society. We have to know how to behave. I think I know it's sort of crude, but that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so are you saying again that this is basically a lesson teaching you not to do child sacrifice?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's right.
Okay, Alan?
On the subject of public blasphemy, I'm thinking about what I understand that happened during the Inquisition, in which Jews were being blasphemous the way we would define God. Yeah. But that led to the creation of the Kol Nidre prayer, so that people could be forgiven for doing that without killing themselves or murder. You know what I mean? Is it?
Yes. I would say yes and no, because the Kol Nidre prayer is older than the Inquisition.
But it's connected with the behavior that was forced the Jews by the Inquisition.
So it is probably true, doubtlessly true, that many Jews who outwardly converted to Catholicism were relying on the Kol Nidre prayer, saying that the Kol Nidre prayer said, everything I swear to do in the next year, I'm renouncing. So it doesn't matter. But it's I imagine they found comfort in that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. But many people think that the Kol Nidre prayer was a response to the situation, and it's not. The Kol Nidre prayer is actually older than and it's technically not the Inquisition, but that's a whole it's a technical.
But this teaching about public blasphemy is Talmudic, though it's from the.
Is that right? I think it's Maimonides.
Oh, so that's it's still before the Inquisition.
The Talmud gives the three as being idolatry, sexual sins, and murder. It's in the Talmud. Public blasphemy is from somewhere else.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't personally looked it up. It's a very good question.
Oh, yeah. Rabbi, I think I didn't read the paragraph before that you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, in medieval Europe, many Jews saw the Akedah as a reflection of their own unwavering faith. It was a heroic act, one that inspired the spiritual heroism of Abraham's descendants.
Yes, that's it.
Some authors are deeply attracted to this perspective as well, seeing it as more authentic than the sensible, dull and tepid religiosity of contemporary times. Isaiah Leibowitz argues that Judaism is uninterested in the ethical and only recognizes mitzvot, divine commands. This he sees as a uniquely Jewish perspective of the singular desire to fulfill the will of God. He notes that Christianity's highest symbol is the crucifixion and the sacrifice which God brings for man, whereas the highest symbol of faith in Judaism is the Akedah, where all man's values are canceled and cast aside for the love and reverence for God. The lesson of the Akedah, he argues, is about putting God before man.
Okay, I'm not sure. I think Christianity's symbol of crucifixion also deals with loyalty to God before loyalty to man. I mean, presumably, Jesus could have hid out, could have left town, could have avoided the sacrifice in some way. But I'll leave that to Jim and colleagues to figure out.
For this point of view, the Akedah stands a corrective to the earlier passage about Saddam. In the Akedah, Abraham changes direction and instead of questioning God, learns to obediently follow his command.
Follow his command.
Most modern commentaries offer a very different perspective. They're troubled by the Akedah and wonder how God could have issued an unethical command. Samuel David Lozado explains that the Akedah is essentially a public stunt.
Publicity stunt.
A way of demonstrating the fullness of Abraham's religious fervor. Unlike the surrounding pagan religions, Abraham's ethical commitments prevent him from performing child sacrifice. An observer might mistake Abraham's ethical refinement for a lack of faith. For this reason, God stages the Akedah to publicly demonstrate Abraham's faith and to show that an ethical religion can still have profound religious passion. The purpose of the Akedah is to undermine child sacrifice and show that one can be passionately attached to God and meticulously ethical at the same time.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of you said in discussing this. And I mean, this is a story of God commanding Abraham to do something, but we don't have any commandments to us about child sacrifice. In the Torah, there are lots of commandments with which many of us would have problems. So, for example, I'll take the one that Erwin raised, the commandment that if you have a stubborn and recalcitrant son, you take him to the city gates and he's stoned to death. I would say many of us, although there may be times when we might be tempted, would have problems with this.
Yes, a lot of problems.
And so what the rabbis of the Talmud say is, yes, this is a commandment from God, but here are all the requirements necessary for us to actually execute the commandment and our son. And when you read through that list, they make it practically impossible to fulfill all of those commandments. Um, so basically, what the rabbis are doing is they're having their cake and eat it too. And another good example of that is 3 times in the Bible, we are told if someone knocks out your eye, you should knock out their eye. And the rabbis proved that it would be impossible to do this justly. So therefore, God didn't mean it. And they come up with other ways of exacting justice. But they would never say that this commandment is not from God. And in the case of Isaac, there's no commandment to us about sacrificing children. I'll point out one thing which I think I mentioned last time also, and that is one of the astonishing things about the Torah, and maybe the entire Bible, is it is a mixture. Let's just focus on Torah. It is not a legal code. It is a mixture of laws. There's lots of laws, presumably 613 in the Torah, but there's also lots of stories. I mean, you have this one, the Akedah. You have the story of Moses splitting the sea. You have the story of, the Moses turning his rod into a snake and the plagues and everything else. Those aren't legal codes, right? There's no laws involved there.
Right.
So, and apparently there is no other ancient legal code that does this. I mean, you have Hammurabi's code and other ancient codes. They are legal codes. But the Torah is this wonderful mix of, shall I say, entertaining stories and legalisms. And I would say, our instinct is to say, what do we learn from these stories? I mean, I think that's
Exactly.
what
do we learn from this?
Okay,
That's
let's
right.
read about what Abraham Isaac Cook has to say. He
Hey,
lived
this-
around the turn of the last century. He was the chief rabbi of Palestine before Israel became a state.
This approach can be taken a step further in a manner suggested by Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook and others. God commands Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy, because the very point of the Akedah is to show that faith should never supersede ethics. The Akedah is actually an example of what should not be done. The Torah's way of making clear that God rejects the unethical. The Akedah is actually an example of what should not be done.
Sorry, they repeated. It was probably like a highlight in the original story.
Right, all right. Seen this way, the Akedah confirms Abraham's actions at Sodom. In the end, the ethical takes religious priority at the Akedah as well.
Okay, we'll read a little more.
Abraham in Sodom versus Abraham at the Akedah is not just the central riddle of the Parsha. It is also the central theological issue in Judaism. Does God come before man, or does man come before God? At first glance, the perspective that puts God before man seems more credible. After all, religion is about God. Compared to him, man seems inconsequential. John Henry Newman, an influential 19th century Catholic theologian, wrote, "The Catholic Church holds it's better for the sun and moon to drop from heaven, for the earth to fall, and for all the many millions on it to die of starvation and extremist agony, as far as temporal affliction goes. Then that one soul, I will not say, should be lost, but should commit one single venial sin, should tell one willful untruth, or should steal one poor farthing without excuse. This may sound extreme, but if God is all that matters, then everything must be done to fulfill his will. Our interest in man is unimportant."
So, Jim, this actually sounds like what you're accusing the Protestants of. And so here we have a 19th century Catholic theologian. But, my strong guess is that this is now not Catholic theology.
Yeah, I had a hard time following it, actually.
Sorry?
I would have to read it a couple times to
Yeah, so basically he is saying it would be better for basically the sun and moon to drop from heaven, the earth to fail, for millions of people to die of starvation, than one soul would commit a single venial sin, tell one willful untruth, or steal one poor farthing, a farthing, think of it as a penny, without excuse. So basically, what he is saying is there is nothing more important than obeying God's will, and that's more important than millions of people starving to death and the sun and the moon falling from the heavens, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think he's going overboard.
Yeah.
And I'm, I don't know anything about this guy.
I do.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know about him. But I don't know anybody that would actually probably side with that at this point. Yeah.
Okay. So let's read a little more, and then we'll get ready to stop and read the rest next time.
The challenge is to find religious arguments for putting man before God. Does humanism, which Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein defines concisely as a worldview which values human highly, have any place in Judaism? The answer is yes, for the very reason that God created man. From a mystical perspective, as Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto explains, the purpose of creation was for God to extend his love and kindness towards man. If so, God cares deeply about man. We should as well. Man who is created in the image of God deserves our love and esteem.
Okay, so on that happy and high note, it's 8 o'clock, and there's no way we're going to get through this because we're on page 3 of 5. So we'll continue reading this next week. And if you think this is fun and interesting, I just came across an article today. I get all these commentaries and I don't read them on time because I get a lot of them. So in probably last week's Torah portion, or maybe 2 weeks ago, we had the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Oh no, that's in this week's? Now I'm confused.
It's in this week. In this Parsha, it's in Vayera. It's this
in Vayera. Okay. So basically, the story ends with a very puzzling story about Lot's 2 daughters getting Lot drunk and seducing him so that they will have children by their father.
Yes.
And that, of course, causes all kinds of interesting problems. And there's actually a pretty long article, but a very interesting article by the woman describes herself not as a feminist, but as a womanist. And she makes the distinction of representing a feminine point of view, but not you all white uppity women, but women of color and who have been suppressed. So, I sort of instinctively have a problem with that attitude, but I have to say the article is really interesting. And what's even more interesting, and this will give you the idea of how much fun you can have with Midrash. She actually rewrites the entire story to teach a different lesson. It has the same result, namely the daughters have children by their father, but she writes a completely different interpretation. And I have to say, I found it absolutely fascinating. So maybe we'll move on to that next time if we finish this. But under the general category of digging into troubling stories in the Bible, which I have to say is one of the things I adore doing. So I hope you enjoy this discussion, and we will continue it next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay. Any
great.
other
really good
final comments? Don't sacrifice your children. In fact, the place I think it's in the Book of Kings, they describe the inheritance of worshiping the fire god Moloch as demanding child sacrifice, and it's considered to be the model of hell. The place where this was done is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, which in Hebrew would be Ge Ben Hinnom, or Gehenna, which is our understanding, which is our name that we give for the I would say the negative afterlife, a place of purgatory of sins. So anyway, child sacrifice, pretty much don't do that.
When people ask us what we learned tonight, we'll always remember that.
Right.
Sacrificing.
Also, I mean, I also like the lesson. For me, is it talks about don't sacrifice your family to your job. The way
Yes,
Abraham sacrificed his family to his job.
exactly.
And I did this. Maybe I'll go through that. That would be a fun thing to do. I will actually. Maybe I'll read a sermon I gave, which deals with the Akedah, and it imagines Isaac on his deathbed, going over what happened to his life and why he gave the blessing to Jacob rather than Esau, and you'll see what my take on.
Can I tell a story about life balance, work balance,
Sure.
And rabbis? Okay, so Rabbi Ken Chasen, who's the rabbi at Leo Beck in L.A., and I won't go through why we were in a room, and I made a comment, and I complimented how well corporately these two synagogues I was involved with, that there are several rabbis, and they run it in a very organized way. And what Rabbi Jason reminded me or taught me was that rabbis are not very good at this life balance until women were introduced into the picture. And so women rabbis have contributed how work balance is important, because women have the sensitivities that Abraham didn't have, to illustrate the point that you're making. And
That's
also
right.
even today's rabbis have benefited for these, learning how to balance taking care of their families and also their congregations.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult problem. I always thought that becoming a rabbi, as I did at age 55, was a benefit, because I didn't have to go through the issues of, do I go to the kids' plays, do I go to their baseball games and birthday parties, or if I have a big business trip or project that I'm working on all night, do I do that?
You
But I
could take
know that when
Saturdays off like we could in corporate world, right?
I'm sorry?
When I worked in corporate, and when you worked in corporate, you
Yeah.
sometimes you got weekends off, but you can't
Yes.
do that as
Yes.
a rabbi.
Yeah. And basically, typically rabbis take one day of the week off. They work Saturdays and Sundays, and Monday is fairly common, and they try and schedule themselves. The problem is there are things we are called upon to do, and they are important to do, and they are worth doing. And the question is, where do you draw the line? And it's very difficult. And I don't necessarily have a good answer. I mean, but I've, now that I've gotten to the age I'm at, and there are things where people have asked me to do for them, and I will say, this is something that's important to do. It's something a rabbi should do, but I'm not going to do it. I just can't add that task to my menu. Good luck. I can give you names of other rabbis, but it is a problem. But I think it's a problem with work life in general. And I don't know if it's gender bias to think that women are better at this than men. I don't know. I just
That's what Rabbi Jason was suggesting.
yeah. Okay.
Which I proudly accepted and in examples, and so yeah, you're right. There's no reason that you and I would know this unless we did a study.
Vice President-elect.
Whoops.
Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, so interesting stuff. We will continue next week with this article.
Thank you.
So I will wish you a good evening. Somebody post it.
It's the night before Thanksgiving.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Oh my
Right?
God. Why wasn't I
wrong?
informed?
I'm sorry, I'm wrong.
No.
Wait, no, next week is
Okay,
first.
yes.
No.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. The following, because when is Thanksgiving? Is that in
the 28th?
Yeah, but
it's
that's
the
not
next week. Sorry.
It's not a Hebrew month, is it? Cheshvan? It's I don't know when it is this year. I'm being silly. Okay, yeah, thank you. And thank you, Stephen, for that. 174A. I'm going to take a look at that. Okay, so we'll see you next time.
All right.
Good night.
Bye, Latow.
I know.